The group of teenagers had always been close-knit. They'd grown up together, gone to school together, and spent most of their free time together. They were a typical group of high school kids. They played sports, went to parties, and talked about their futures. But there was one member of the group who was a little different. His name was Tommy, and he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia a few years earlier. Tommy's friends had always been supportive of him. They knew he struggled with hallucinations and delusions, but they didn't treat him any differently. They included him in everything they did, and they were always there to listen when he needed to talk. But as they got older, they began to notice that Tommy's symptoms were getting worse. He seemed more paranoid and anxious than ever before, and his delusions were becoming more elaborate. One night, the group decided to have a sleepover at Tommy's house. They knew his parents were out of town, and they thought it would be a fun way to spend the weekend. They arrived at Tommy's house in the early evening, bringing with them snacks, games, and sleeping bags. They settled in for a night of movies and laughter, but as the night wore on, things took a dark turn. Tommy became increasingly agitated as the night went on. He kept muttering to himself and looking around the room nervously. His friends tried to reassure him, but he seemed to be getting more and more paranoid. Eventually, he stood up and announced that they were all in danger. "Can't you see it?" he said, his voice shaking. "They're coming for us. The shadows. They are all around us." His friends were taken aback by his sudden outburst. They'd seen him have delusions before, but this was different. He seemed genuinely terrified, and his friends didn't know what to do. They tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. As the night wore on, Tommy's behavior became more erratic. He started pacing around the room, muttering to himself and occasionally shouting out warnings about the shadows. His friends tried to calm him down, but he was beyond reasoning with. Then, things took a turn for the worse. Tommy suddenly lunged at one of his friends, grabbing him by the throat and pinning him against the wall. His eyes were wild with fear, and his grip was incredibly strong. His friends tried to pull him off, but he wouldn't let go. Eventually, they managed to pry Tommy's hands off their friend's throat, but the damage had already been done. The friend was gasping for air, his face turning red. They quickly called an ambulance, and the friend was rushed to the hospital. The rest of the group was in shock. They'd never seen Tommy behave like that before. They were all scared, but they were also worried about their friend. They didn't know what to do. The police were called to investigate the incident, and Tommy was taken into custody. His friends were questioned about what had happened, but they didn't know what to say. They were still reeling from the attack, and they were struggling to understand what had happened. Over the next few weeks, things only got worse. The friend who had been attacked was in a coma, and no one knew if he would ever wake up. The group was torn apart by the incident, and they struggled to come to terms with what had happened. Meanwhile, Tommy's mental health continued to decline. He was transferred to a psychiatric hospital, where he was given medication to help manage his symptoms. But the medication didn't seem to be working. He was still plagued by delusions and hallucinations, and he became increasingly paranoid. One night, a few months after the incident, the remaining members of the group decided to visit Tommy at the hospital. They hadn't seen him since he was taken into custody, and they wanted to see how he was doing. As they approached his room, they heard him talking to someone. "I know you're there," he said, his voice slow and urgent. I can hear you. What do you want? His friends hesitated outside the door, unsure of what to do. They didn't want to interrupt, but they also didn't want to leave him alone if he was experiencing another delusion. As they listened, they heard a strange voice reply. I want you to do something for me, the voice said. Something important. But you have to trust me. Tommy's friends exchanged worried glances. They had never heard him respond to a hallucination like this before. They didn't know what was happening. What do you want me to do? Tommy asked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause, and then the voice spoke again. I want you to come with me, it said. We have to go to the other side. Tommy's friends felt a chill run down their spines. They didn't know what the other side was, but it didn't sound good. Suddenly, Tommy's door swung open, and he stepped out into the hallway. His eyes were wide, and he was breathing heavily. I have to go with him, he said, his voice urgent. He needs my help. His friends tried to reason with him, but he wouldn't listen. He was convinced that he had to follow the voice, that it was the only way to keep his friends safe. As they watched in horror, Tommy sprinted down the hallway, his hospital gown trailing behind him. His friends ran after him, but they couldn't keep up. Tommy disappeared around a corner, and they lost sight of him. They searched the hospital for hours, but they couldn't find him. The police were called, and a search party was organized, but there was no sign of Tommy. He had vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and the search for Tommy continued. His friends were beside themselves with worry. They didn't know if he was alive or dead, or if he was still experiencing hallucinations and delusions. Then, one night, they received a phone call from an unknown number. When they answered, they heard Tommy's voice on the other end. Guys, he said, his voice trembling. You have to help me. I'm trapped. They asked him where he was, but he couldn't give them a straight answer. He seemed disoriented, like he wasn't sure where he was or what was happening. We're coming for you, they said. Just tell us where you are. But before he could respond, the line went dead. The next day, they received another call. This time, it was from the police. They had found Tommy's body in a remote area of the woods. He had been dead for several days, and his body was badly decomposed. The group was devastated. They couldn't believe that Tommy was gone. They didn't know how he had gotten to the woods, or what had happened to him. They didn't know if he had been experiencing a delusion when he died, or if something else had happened. The investigation into Tommy's death continued for months, but no answers were ever found. His friends were left to grieve in silence, wondering what had happened to their friend and why they couldn't save him. The incident had left them all scarred, and they knew that they would never be the same again.